Hello, and welcome to today's edition of Ask the Expert. My name is Madeline Countess, and I'll be your moderator for today. Our session today is going to focus on considerations between absence and payroll and the interactions between these two very important functional areas within Workday. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a director in our HCM practice here at Collaborative Solutions. I've been in the Workday ecosystem for about 10 years, and I have 7 years of experience as an HR practitioner. I'll be joined by a couple of my colleagues today, so let me introduce to you Brian Capon. Brian?
Hey, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm Brian Capon, one of the senior managers on our time and absence team. I've been with Collaborative Solutions for about just over 5 years, but in the Workday ecosystem, doing implementations for just over 8 years. Thank you, Madeline.
Thank you, Brian. Next up, we have Casper Randall.
Hi, my name is Casper Randall. I am with the payroll department. I'm the functional architect. I have been with Collaborative Solutions going on almost 7 years now at this point, but I've been implementing HR systems for getting close to 20. So it's good talking to everybody today.
Thanks, Casper. And we also have Anna King from our OC&T organization. Anna?
Hi, everyone. I'm Anna King. I'm an organizational change and training consultant with Collaborative. I've been with Collaborative for about 1.5 years now, but I've been in the Workday ecosystem for about 4 years. Happy to be here.
Right. Thanks, Anna. So I'll say a few words about Collaborative, and as usual, we'll jump right into the content that I know you're all anxious to hear. For those of you who are new to Collaborative as a Workday partner, we are a full platform finance, HR, and student transformation consultancy. We offer the full range of services, including strategy, transformation, organizational change and training, and post-production support. We're very proud to be a part of the Cognizant family and to have been one of the original 4 Workday implementation partners. We have a huge group of product leads here who represent every functional area that Workday has. So we bring a lot of expertise to our projects and to our customers. One of the things that we are super proud of here is all of our workplace awards that we've won. We truly believe that happy consultants make happy customers. So we focus on making sure that our consultants are the most experienced consultants in the ecosystem, and also the consultants who are happy to come to work and are looking to make your implementation or your Workday tenant the best tenant that it can be. So let's jump in to the material that we've prepared for you today. So first, we want to talk a little bit at a high level about how Workday payroll and Workday absence interact. So I'd like to ask Brian to jump in and give us his perspective from the absence side, and then we'll talk to Casper from a payroll perspective. Brian?
Sure thing. Thank you, Madeline. So with Workday absence and payroll, definitely closely related. Oftentimes we're using the same calculation engine. At a very high level, time offs and leave types on the absence side, they're tied to payroll, incorporated into earnings codes and run categories. And once these absence transactions are approved in Workday, so once those transactions, those business processes are completed, they flow directly over to payroll, and they drive the pay, drive the appropriate payroll earning. And I'm going to pass it over to Casper to shed a little more light on what exactly is happening on the payroll side.
Thanks, Brian. So on the payroll side, what we're kind of looking at when we're talking about absences, we're actually talking about 2 different flavors. We are talking about time offs, we are talking about leaves. So when we're actually looking in the system, they actually interact with payrolls differently. So when you actually have a time off, it's flowing across, and there's actually tags that are associated on the back side of those time offs. They are tied to either time off approved, time off as a whole itself. And we in payroll actually go and attach ourselves to that time off approved, and we actually pull it in based on that criteria itself. Now, leaves are a little bit different. Leaves are on the leave side, they're determined whether they're a paid leave or they're a non-paid leave. If they're a non-paid leave, then they come across and there's a payroll effect that says cut off their pay. And then it doesn't flow across to payroll at all. If it's a paid leave, though, it can be coming across to us, but it could be that we are tying into a different earning type than your standard regular earnings. Maybe it's some sort of parental leave or FMLA, whatever it might be, it's tied to. That'll actually be in entirely its own earning code. And we typically do that because of the fact that sometimes these are paid differently. It could be that instead of receiving 100% pay, we're actually receiving only 60% pay, something along those lines. So it really depends on what flavor that we're looking at for the time offs versus the leaves and really how they interact. But traditionally, they do go to their own individual codes themselves. Okay.
Thanks, Casper. That's very helpful. So as we think about how those are paid out, can you talk a little bit about what we would expect to see from a payroll perspective? Are all leaves paid at the same rate, or do some of them fluctuate based on other things that are in our tenant?
Absolutely. For leaves themselves, traditionally it's there can be percentages based leaves, and then they would be receiving just their compensation times 8% of whatever that leave that they have on within the system itself. Time offs, though, traditionally within most corporations, normally for your salary folk, for your exempt population, they are receiving their salary. Time offs traditionally reduce their salaries and then get paid out of that individual earning code itself. So when we're talking about something like PTO, pay time off, you are receiving, say for instance, 1 day of PTO, and that equates to $300. Well, you are getting paid out on the earning code of PTO, but it is reducing your salary by that $300 for that individual item. So it's still making that your salary as a whole is full and complete, but we are making sure that for the GL purposes, when it goes across, it is coming out of PTO. That way, when it goes into the GL, it can reduce the accrual balance that they have outstanding on the liability. So that's traditionally what we do for the different leaves versus the time offs within the system itself.
Thanks, that's helpful. And certainly we know that it's important for employees to receive a full paycheck. So Brian, anything to share from your side on how pay might fluctuate from an absence perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. So as many of you on the call are, I'm sure, aware, leave, sometimes it's not consistent behavior in terms of how it's paid for different events, different scenarios, different employees. For situations where the leave is paid at a consistent rate regardless of the situation or the circumstance, you can get away with one single leave type to drive a fixed rate of pay for the duration that that worker's on leave. But for those scenarios that I mentioned earlier where it truly fluctuates and varies, you'll need possibly multiple leave types. So some examples are maybe varying levels of disability where it starts off at 100% pay, drops to 70% pay, drops to unpaid. In that scenario, that would be potentially 3 different leave types, each driving a specific rate of pay that you would need to place the worker on over the total duration that they're on leave. Or in those scenarios where it's not always that fixed percentage, if we look at the second question here, we can leverage pay inputs. You can get away with a single leave type that has a consistent pay setting by default, whether it's going to always be a fully paid or an unpaid. And then part of that leave process, you would enter a pay input directly into payroll, keying in exactly what the behavior should be, what pay should that worker receive over the course of their leave of absence. Oftentimes we see this where in certain states there is a state disability insurance, and that rate that is covered by the state varies by circumstance, by worker. So once that's confirmed, some companies we see it's their policy to true them up, pay whatever the difference is to make them whole, and that percentage, that piece, because that fluctuates, oftentimes we see pay inputs leveraged in those scenarios.
Thanks. That I wasn't aware of that level of complexity, but I could see how that would vary by state and by corporate policy. Casper, anything to add on your side for how that might work and considerations we should be thinking about?
Sure, absolutely. As Brian did mention, you know, when we have a leave and if it's a fixed type of thing, then traditionally we can do it as an automated process through leave to payroll itself. One of the big ones that, well, it's not big anymore, but it used to be big, that we traditionally see is actually military leave. So I kind of wanted to bring that up. When we're talking about reservists and things like that, you know, they have the 2 weeks a year that they need to actually be out and go through their additional training. And traditionally what we do is those will be time offs within the system. So they just go in and input them as time offs, just like PTO or whatever it might be. But then there's actually deployment. Deployment usually falls into a category that somebody's going out for 6, 8 year plus within the system itself. And then that's traditionally that we leave that we put them on, and it would be an unpaid leave. But a lot of companies, they actually like to treat their employees well. And that what they do is they actually see what they are getting paid through the military versus what they actually get paid through the corporation itself. So this is a great example of something that's a payroll input. It's something that we can't regulate because the companies are actually going through and making up the pay difference between what they get paid in the military versus what they get paid from the company. So they would actually need to receive the pay slips from the soldiers themselves while they're on deployment. And that is one of those things that they look at it and say, you know, here's what the company was paying you, here's what the military, we're going to make up the difference. We're going to go ahead and put this in payroll input so that you are still getting paid what we would have been paying you if you hadn't been deployed. So that's an excellent question in regards to an item, an example that what would be something that would go in through payroll input.
Okay, thanks, Casper, and thanks for sharing that information about military leave. I know we've been talking a little bit about disability, and that, of course, brings us very nicely into our next topic. So specifically for our US-based customers, FMLA is obviously something of great concern. Our customers are no doubt very interested in being compliant with all of the rules and regulations there. So let's start with Brian and talk about what that looks like from a leave perspective, and then we'll jump back to Casper from the payroll side. Thanks, Brian.
Thank you. So with FMLA, common configuration expectation is that you're going to have certain company leaves specific to company policy, but they should run concurrently or deduct from that FMLA entitlement. So most commonly, we see examples of that with maternity, paternity, where there's a company policy that might be the same amount, might be a little less, could be more generous than an FMLA entitlement. But once they're placed on that maternity or paternity, we want to also deduct from their FMLA entitlement. Some considerations here would be, do you want to set it up in Workday terminology as a coordinated leave, where you only place them on one leave type and it deducts from 2 leave entitlements? Or are we going to place them on concurrent leaves, in which case they're actually going to see 2 overlapping leave of absence events? The considerations there are definitely reporting. Do you want to report on everyone on on FMLA at a given time, or do you want the flexibility of reporting and differentiating between who's on a maternity that's deducting from an FMLA versus paternity versus a workers' compensation? And then also, are there any expectations, again, on the changes in that worker's pay over the course of that leave? Going back to what we mentioned in the previous topic, if that rate fluctuates, there may be a need to place them on multiple leaves over the course of their entire absence. So one scenario we see is they'll be placed on a single FMLA for the entire duration of their leave, but that will be broken up into multiple segments of other leave types, whether it's other disability or personal leaves that might vary in pay over the course of their absence, in which case, again, that would be handled via multiple leave types or pay inputs that would overlap with FMLA.
Thanks. So Brian, any other things that we need to consider for FMLA? I know you have a lot of experience implementing this, so any other considerations or tips that you could share with our customers today?
Absolutely. So I know we've been talking mainly about leave of absence, but a common overlap with FMLA is also the time off perspective, your vacation and sick. So anticipate needing to enter absences, the time off pieces for vacation and sick so that employees can receive pay while on FMLA. You can enter that directly on the absence calendar, make that a manager task, make that an absence partner task, or you can just enter a time off adjustment, manually key in the number of hours of vacation or sick that they've taken in the pay period that they're on leave. No need to go through the absence calendar, no need to select which specific days that you want to deduct vacation and sick. Now, with payroll, a consideration for anyone joining us today who does not currently have a workday absence and maybe exploring that as an option. With FMLA, the eligibility is they need to have worked 1,250 hours within the last 12 months of their leave date. Now, we set that up in Workday where we're looking at that value. It's coming from payroll. We're looking at how many hours paid in the last 12 months has that worker received. So that's payroll history. And I want to call out that for folks first going live on Workday, you're not going to have 12 months of payroll history. So this is something that we always need to prep folks first implementing Workday absence and payroll. When you cut over at Go Live, make sure you have historical payroll reports to see what those hours worked, because that eligibility for FMLA for that first 12 months, it's not automatically going to be in Workday unless you're converting payroll history.
Thanks. That is not something I was aware of, so super helpful. I think we're next going to continue on this payroll theme. So Casper, can you tell us a little bit about what kinds of things we should be considering based on our period schedules on the payroll side?
Well, before we get to the period schedules, I wanted to go kind of back to in regards to the FMLA. The big thing that I want to talk about for leaves is actually, so if you are on leave, what are you getting paid? So this is always in payroll a run category question. So when you actually are looking at the engine behind payroll itself, which is the run category, there is actually a non-effective data tab. And on that tab, you actually have to tell the system everything that you want it to get paid while on leave. So maybe it's an unpaid leave. Well, what does that mean? Are you getting paid out your various allowances? So If you have a car allowance or a technology allowance, are you still getting paid that, or does it not get paid at all? What about holidays within the system? Are you still getting paid that holiday if you're on leave? So you actually have to tell the system everything that I want it to pay while you're on leave, if it's an unpaid leave. If it's a paid leave, we still have to tell it what you want it to get paid. So there is the big determination of the run category within the system itself, and actually marking down everything that you want to go through. Pretty much you have to go through every single one of your earning codes, every single one of your deduction codes, and say, do I want this to process or not? So if you're on leave, do you actually want it to process through your deductions too? Because that would trigger, if you don't have pay, it going into arrears and actually trying to recoup it the next time that you do have pay. So we actually have to look at those rules in regards to the run cat of leaves themselves.
That's
And
helpful. I know I've heard that on the HCM side for benefits and how some companies handle that, and that is definitely a policy decision. So next, Casper?
I think we're going to start with Brian real quick on the period schedules.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Casper. Brian,
Thank you.
period
So,
schedules.
yeah, period schedules. This is an important piece, more so on the time off side. With period schedules often being owned by payroll, but being referenced heavily on the absence side, hey Casper, there needs to be some coordination there. So when we're thinking about period schedules with time off, what does that drive? For your PTO plans, vacation plans, sick plans that are accrued as an upfront annual amount, one-time accrual at the start of the balance period, period schedules are not that impactful outside of reporting. But for your accruals, your vacation, sick plans that accrue on a per period basis, most commonly we see that align with your pay periods, your period schedules that are being owned and referenced on the payroll side. And the important piece there is making sure that there's communication around maintenance of those period schedules. What Workday recommends is when you go live, you have 2 to 3 years worth of period schedules built out. And on the payroll side, what we most commonly see are bi-weekly period schedules. It's important to note that you're only able to request time off if a period schedule for that date exists. If you're keeping up with the Workday recommendation of keeping your period schedules built out the next 2 to 3 years, that's not going to be an issue. We don't typically see people planning vacation that far in advance. Now, I have gone in providing some support for folks that have been on Workday for a while, and I have seen the situations where they're not updating the following year's period schedules until maybe December of the current year. Now, what that means is no one's going to be able to request time off the next year until you get those period schedules in. Sometimes that's something I see as an oversight when folks are planning their end of year updates.
So from a payroll aspect, Brian's correct. Payroll does own period schedules. It's something that we share between time, absence, and payroll, but traditionally we're the owners of it. So period schedules, as Brian said, it is a requirement from Workday that when you go live with payroll, that you have 2 years of period schedules within the system. That way you always should not have a problem in regards to being able to request absences and things like that. So traditionally with year-end processes, there's a year-end checklist within the payroll department, and this is just one of the several different tasks that we have to go out and update, is maintaining that, your first year, you're coming to the end, and we need to go through the checklist in regards to everything that we need to update. And that includes, yes, we already have next year's period schedule in the system, but we want to go ahead and put the year after that into the system. That way you're never actually running up to the point where it's getting to December and we don't have January in the system. People can't actually request their time offs because that leads to problems right there. Yep.
Thanks, Casper. So next we're going to turn our attention to testing. And I think, Brian, why don't you go ahead and share your perspective and your tips on testing. And then let's make sure that we hear from Anna from the change management perspective. So go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, absolutely. So for testing, because there is a lot of overlap between absence and payroll, we need communication there and we need coordination. It's important that you're testing retro events, retro absence transactions. You're testing overlapping events. As we mentioned earlier, a common scenario is leaves overlapping, concurrent leaves, time off requests overlapping with leave events to supplement pay. And then, of course, testing in periods that have a holiday. As Casper mentioned, there's a lot of variations of what we see in terms of holiday pay when someone's absent or when somebody's on leave, how much holiday pay should they receive in a given period that coincides with one of their absences. So those are some of those key transactions that we would always recommend focusing on. Retro events, overlapping events, and holidays. And I know Casper and Anna, I believe, will have some additional call outs and considerations for testing.
Sure, absolutely. So from a payroll aspect, Brian was correct in regards to retro. Retro is a huge thing within payroll itself, and it's actually come quite a ways for Workday themselves in regards to everything that they've been able to include within retro since they actually started payroll itself more than a decade ago at this point. So the other big thing though for payroll aspect, time offs usually are not too big of a deal for testing. They flow across. If they're salaried, they reduce their salary and then they pay out. If you're an hourly person, it just pays you for that time. The big thing that we want to be testing though is leave. And leave, again, is the determination based on run categories, what's getting processed on leave, but also what happens within the payroll itself when you're going to and coming from leave itself. So one of the big things that we always like to do is mid-period changes, because we all know that things like having a baby, it's not really on the timetable. It's not going to be on the period itself. It's going to happen when it happens, and people need to go out and take care of that. So I always say, let's look at leave, but let's look at it mid-period. How does it affect the period that you're going on leave or coming back from leave? That's one of the big things that I like to test.
Thanks, Casper. Again, always helpful. I think next, let's turn to Anna and hear from Anna how our C&T practice can really get involved here and leverage this information as we're going through testing.
Absolutely. So up into testing, at this point, the organizational change and training team has definitely laid a foundation for more of the change management component of the work that we're doing for the project. But once we get to testing, this is when we really start to switch gears, and we're really relying on the information gathered from the functional team in order to create our training needs analysis, or rather training needs assessment, as well as our training curriculum plan. So once we have the build at a place where we can go ahead and get started on those training materials, we definitely want to make sure that we are using as much time within the testing period as possible in order to make sure that we are creating, developing, and eventually delivering the training that the customer needs. So this really varies, and at the point to where we have gotten through our training curriculum plan and we understand what exactly the training is going to look like, we have several options. So for those of you who may not be as familiar with OC&T and what we typically deliver for our customers, this can take various forms. We can create job aids, and we have created job aids, as well as training videos and even webinars, especially during 2020, virtual webinars are definitely popular for relaying training needs for both payroll and absence. So there isn't really a set formula as to what type of training would be most appropriate for leave versus payroll, for example. However, there really is an emphasis on making sure that employee self-service and manager self-service are represented if that is within scope for the customer in the training efforts that we deploy.
May have already covered, but I will defer to my colleague Casper. It's really what about holiday pay while you're on leave? So gentlemen?
Sure. So again, I did kind of mention earlier that holiday.
Brian? Or, oh, Casper, thanks.
Sorry, I forgot to flip on my camera there. So I did kind of mention a minute ago that, while on leave, holiday is one of those things that we really need to take a determination if you should be actually still receiving that pay within the system itself. And it's something that from coming from Brian within absence, it can come up from a couple of different places. So it actually can come from the true time off, or it can come from the holiday calendar. So there's two different ways we can actually pull in holiday pay into the system itself. If we're truly coming from time off is going to tell me the number of hours that it's actually sending over to me, whether it's, the person's working an 8-hour day or if they're a 12-hour day type of person. So it would actually be telling me that here's 12 hours of holiday pay, I'm going to pay it through. And again, that's based on the company's policies in regards to the run cat that we actually set up within the system itself, whether we should be paying it or not paying it. The other way that it can come across, though, is from the holiday calendar within the system. Now, the holiday calendar just says, here's the day. It doesn't say the number of hours or anything. So I actually have to take a look at what is their daily hours within the system. And where we're going to get it complex within the system is if you have employees that have something like flex pay. So 1 week they're working 44 hours, the next week they're working 36 hours. So when you're looking at those types of things, it gets a little bit troublesome in order to try to determine the number of hours that we actually want to process from the calendar itself. So the other thing is, what happens if the person's working 4/10s and the day off that they're not working is that holiday? Are they still supposed to get paid for it? So these are all policy questions and decisions that the company actually needs to make when we're actually looking at something like holiday pay, especially with leave that's associated to it. So Brian, I don't know if you have anything else that you want to add in from the absence side there?
Yeah, sure thing. So yeah, holiday, always a fun topic, especially holiday while on leave. So as Casper mentioned, there's ways to automatically drive this looking at the holiday calendar. What I'm seeing more and more customers adopt for those scenarios where somebody is on leave and they need to receive holiday pay. What we're seeing is, and this falls a little more so on overlaps with time tracking as well, a holiday time code. So when an employee is not on leave, they'll automatically receive pay with payroll looking at the holiday calendar, or we have time calculations that automatically generate holiday time blocks based on the employee's work schedule, giving an exact hours per day or based on their FTE. While they're on leave though, if you recall an example I mentioned earlier, we have some situations where state might be supplementing pay, might be supplementing a certain percentage of that employee's pay while they're on leave. And in doing so, the company only wants to pay the additional percentage to true them up to 100%. And we're seeing that this could apply to holiday hours as well. So how do we handle it? How do we make that a determination of what's that prorated holiday pay and how does that get to payroll? The process that I'm seeing more commonly adopted is manually keying in the exact holiday hours for the duration of the leave. It is unfortunately a manual process, but for most folks, there's not that many holidays that need to be entered, and this could be something that the manager owns, or we can leverage reporting to see workers on leave over certain periods that holidays occurring, and you can mass load either as an absence code or a time entry code the holiday hours via an EIB web service. Another example where we would recommend you do not automatically pay holiday while on leave and key it in manually are those scenarios where it's company policy that they will receive the holiday pay for the first 10 weeks of their leave, but if they're on leave for more than 10 weeks, anything after that 10th week, any holiday that occurs is unpaid. So with those scenarios, because similar to the challenge around fluctuating pay, when we have fluctuating behavior around holiday pay while on leave, that one we would recommend automatically limiting the holiday pay and not paying them from the holiday calendar and just keying those in manually.
Thanks, Brian. Wow, I had no idea this was so complex. So that's the end of our prepared material for today. If you have questions and want to enter them into the chat, go ahead. We do not currently have any questions, so I'll just, by way of wrap up, I want to let everyone know that we will be taking a break from our normal semi-monthly cadence. This month, we'll be focusing on 2020 R2. We will pick back up in the beginning of October, and we're planning 3 additional Ask the Expert sessions for the remainder of the year, focusing on year-end topics. So think performance, advanced comp, and then payroll year-end processing. Those are our 3 Ask the Experts that we have planned for the remainder of the year. We're looking forward to you joining us. Just confirming, we do not have any questions, so we're going to end our webinar here today. We look forward to hearing from you and seeing you on an Ask the Expert. Oh, did we get one, Lindsay?
Yes, we've had a couple
Thanks.
come through now.
Excellent.
So the first question is, we're looking at putting the basics, not the run dates, etc., out a couple years out and then going back to update the payroll details. Is there a concern with this approach?
So I'm assuming from when they're actually asking that, they're talking about the holiday calendar within the system itself, and you're talking about your standard holidays within the U.S., I'm assuming, because that's the majority of our population right now. So of course, New Year's, Thanksgiving, Christmas type things. And there's not usually so much of an issue in regards to doing that several years in advance. You do want to be, of course, cognizant of, if they were falling onto the holidays, you do want to make sure that you are putting those basic standard holidays out there. I haven't seen any type of issues with doing that several years in advance. Brian, I don't know if you have at all. But from my perspective, it doesn't hurt anything if you are actually being proactive and going out there and doing, say the next 5 years if you would like to.
Yeah, if we're talking about holiday calendars, absolutely, we recommend give us, when we're doing the implementation, give us as far to the future of holiday calendars as you have confirmed. We can set up those events. Would also encourage folks, again, on the topic of holiday calendars, to minimize that end of year activity manual updates. Leverage the recurring events on the holiday calendar. So we know certain holidays are always on the same day of the month each year. And so those, you can set that up as a one-time recurring event, so you don't need to manually add it year after year.
So it looks like I was actually mistaken. The first question was about period schedules. Period schedules, I have no problem if you go out there and put in period schedules for the next 50 years. We know what dates are going to happen. The system knows what happens on leap year. It automatically creates that 29th day in February type thing. I actually have joked in the past that during implementation, let's put in the period schedules for the next 50 years, and then we're going to retire and it's the next person's problem. So you can actually go out there and put in to the system for many, many years if you would like. It's just the one thing that I do say, that is, if you only put in 10 years, is somebody going to remember after 10 years that they have to go and put it into the system? So it's one of those caveats that, yeah, you can do it, sure, absolutely. But is somebody eventually going to get around to the point that they do remember to put it in? Because if it's not something that's part of a standard yearly process, like a year-end checklist, to go put in the next year's, the year after that's period schedule, is it going to get dropped at some point? And then we're going to run into problems when we're in December and somebody's trying to put in their vacation for January.
All right. Thanks, Casper. We have had a couple of questions come in. So the next question, I think, is for Brian. The question is, do you have recommendations for switching time off period schedules for an existing time off plan?
Good question, and that's a challenging one. Unfortunately, not an easy undertaking. So with Workday, once you've created a time off plan, once you have any events associated, once you have any usage of that time off plan, you will not be able to change the period schedule within that time off plan. That field is going to be locked because changing that period schedule, if you're allowed to, would impact historical events. So if you are going to shift period schedules, and a scenario could be maybe you're changing your payroll schedules, and we know that absence oftentimes follows the pay periods. Or if you're bringing in, you've acquired another company and you're consolidating period schedules, what you would need to do is create a new time off plan, duplicate your existing time off plan, and add the new period schedule. You need to add a cutover date to deactivate the old time off plan as of a certain date, and then transfer the balances from the old plan into the new plan. Easier said than done, but absolutely possible, something that I've supported quite a few times. Other considerations for that are also time off events. Because you are creating a new plan, do you want to convert any future dated approved time offs that were entered against the old plan? Or do you want the employees to go in and re-enter those time offs? And is there a need to report on any, convert any historical time offs for the new plan? That one I haven't really seen, but definitely outside of just the configuration and setup, take into consideration the data conversion effort that would be involved with shifting the period schedules on an existing time off plan.
Thanks, Brian. And before you leave us, there's another question around this same topic that you've touched on a little bit, but the question is really, what best practices, what tips, considerations can you give us when you're transferring balances between time off plans? This one looks like it was specifically as a result of a pay period or a pay frequency change, but definitely looking for our expert guidance on how we might accomplish that.
Yeah, so within Workday, as far as transferring balances, so loading a balance override, we're restricted to loading that as of a period start date. So if we're looking at a semi-monthly period or a bi-weekly period, my recommendation, if possible, as you time it, try to do it where you have a bi-weekly period where the start date of that period is as close to a semi-monthly period start date, the 1st to the 15th. So it can be a clean extract the balance from the period start date from your bi-weekly plan and then load it as of the same period start date in the semi-monthly plan. Now, if that's not possible, then we just want to get as close to that period start date as possible. And there may be some catch-up transactions required. We might have a gap of 2 or 3 days where we may need to load time off taken or time adjustments, or possibly some accrual adjustments if any accruals occurred between those periods. But I think the big takeaway is try to line it up with the period start dates as closely as you can from the plan that's ending and the new plan.
Okay, thanks, Brian. I think we have one last question for you before we end. And the question is, can you use leave or time off for furlough? So in furlough situations, how do we typically see that handled from your perspective?
So yeah, especially this year, that's been an absence type popping up a lot. What we have most commonly been seeing is a leave of absence set up for that. And then you can have, depending on the population size, again, leverage web services to place workers on leave and return them from leave when needed. As of yet, I haven't seen time off leveraged as much for those types of absences. It's mainly been leave of absence, and you have the flexibility of reporting, who's on a furlough at any given date or period.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. We are at the end of our time. We will be publishing this webinar next week with written FAQ containing the answers, and we look forward to rejoining you for the next Ask the Expert, which will be in the beginning of October. Thanks all.